Hello everybody, welcome to Drawing Together. I'm Scott, this is Artist Network Drawing Together. I love seeing everybody chime in, saying where you are watching from, whether it's from another part of the world or whether it's from 2 floors up. It's exciting to see everybody together. So this is what we're working on today. We have this portrait. Now you may notice a difference. So if you're new, you're going to want to know that you can find the reference image in the description. So you'll find the URL. You actually have to copy and paste that into a browser in order to see it. That reference image, it actually shows a bit more of this subject's face. My original intent was to do a big, kind of a more full portrait. As I was exploring that as a subject, though, I realized that that's a lot to bite off in a single session. And really what was drawing me to this image was the expression in the eyes. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on for this, but I wanted to make sure that you have the full head in case you wanted to do the full portrait of this man and incorporate his mouth, more the nose, etc. So if you're following along, feel free to call out any questions you may have in the chat. It helps if you type them out in all caps so I can see them and kind of filter them from the field of comments that are coming through. So I see more people chiming in from all over the place. Welcome everybody. It's awesome seeing some familiar names here. So that cracks me up, Rachel. So thank you for that. Let's see, I'm just looking to see if there's any questions here, but we're going to dig right into it. It looks like everybody's good to go. So you can see this is my preparatory sketch. I kind of left it unfinished here because I was really focusing on the eyes. Today, hopefully, we'll finish it up a little bit more. The paper we're using is the gray toned paper. This is the Strathmore that I've used before. I believe it's Strathmore. Yes, this toned gray paper. I feel like it works really well for a variety of media. So if you have graphite and white, pastel or white charcoal, that'll work fine for this as well if you don't have the charcoal. So I'm actually going to be working with charcoal today. I've got an HB, a 6B, and this white charcoal. They're all General's brand, which it seems to work out pretty well for me. I have a monoplastic eraser and my kneaded eraser somewhere. I've got one right here. That's where it went. So I've got a kneaded eraser. This is an old one that I've been using for a while. You can see how dark it gets. You can use these things for quite a while. So I've got my kneaded eraser. I don't need this vine charcoal. And then I have my trusty shading stump today. So, or a blending stump or tortillon. So we're going to get started. Again, I'm just going to do a quick scan of the chat to see if anybody has any questions. It looks like we're good to go. The challenge in this that I really wanted to focus on, again, is the expression. So we've drawn eyes before in the series. We've talked a lot about kind of general proportions, general structure to the eye. What I want to focus now on is the structure around the eye. And we've talked about that to some degree before in how we develop a portrait in thinking of the structure, the eyes as part of a larger system. They're not individual elements that are kind of stuck onto the head. They're actually integrated into it. So I want to kind of spend a bit more time focusing on that. One of the things that I looked at and after doing the study is I felt like I could have brought everything down in value a little bit more. And so I'm going to do that with this. So I've got my charcoal pencil here. You can see I've taken a razor blade to it to expose a bit more of the core. That allows me to access more of the side of the charcoal and start to build up some ground that I can work from. So we're starting with this gray paper, which is helpful, and we're going to be utilizing that, but I think I want to drop everything down just a little bit more in value than what the gray toned kind of starts me with. And in general, we know the light is coming in from this side, hitting this side of his head. And so I'm going to kind of essentially start with a gradient, blocking in some just major values in here. And as I'm doing this, my mind is kind of on the subject matter. I'm looking at the subject quite a bit to kind of get a sense for some basic proportions and where things are going to sit on the page. I have this cropped version here. If you have the full version up, you may end up wanting to zoom in a little bit on it to see, make sure that it fills the page properly. The one kind of key feature that I'm observing is that the nose is generally in the center of the paper, but it's a little bit off to the left. The center is right here, right inside the brow of the nose. Is kind of right there in the center. So then the nose kind of sits off to the left of that. We have one eye off to the left and one off to the right. Question here is, what's the pencil company called, Gabriel? It is General. OBB answered that one. So these are General's pencils. I look at brands, but I don't actually spend a whole lot of time really assessing the differences between the brands. This is just what I happen to get, and I think it works out really well. I know some artists that prefer one brand over another. So the approach that I take, and if you're new, this may be a little bit different for everybody who's been joining the series, is I like to start by thinking of the drawing as a series of shapes rather than lines. I want to try to bring in line in a little bit later, because for me, I have a hard time interpreting the mass of a line. So what you may find in some tutorials is the idea that you map out the structure using lines to kind of indicate where the edges will be. And that works for many artists, but I found that I struggle with that. So you can see, like, I'm kind of doing that here with the nose, taking some of these lines and kind of mapping out some of the key features. Where I struggle with that is that I'm often going to be off on those proportions because they don't have a substantive weight to them. If I can start by thinking of larger shapes of value first, and I get to the point where I'm thinking of these as three-dimensional objects, then I feel like I've become a bit more accurate in interpreting the proportions properly. So especially with portraiture. So that's, and I say that to kind of illustrate that you want to find the process that works for you. And I think you can learn a lot from, a variety of different approaches, but you just kind of know that you have, every opportunity, to adapt things to your own needs based on what's working and what's not. So for me, again, I like to just start by thinking of mass early, and then I can bring in line as more of an expressive element later. Need to remember to kind of change the direction of my marks. And as I'm doing this, as I'm building up these layers, I'm keeping my eyes out of focus. I'm rolling the pencil in my fingers here, so I'm constantly kind of engaging a different portion of the pencil. And by squinting, I can see these larger shapes of light and shadow. And I don't want to be thinking too much about this. Like I'm thinking about it, but I'm not necessarily being very precise at this point. I want to react to the photograph, react to the proportions, and get something on there that then I can correct and adjust from there. But it helps me to have something on the page that I can move around rather than trying to get it 100% correct right off the bat. And when you squint, it does two things, or when you blur your eyes, it does two things. It reduces the amount of light coming into your eyes, and it prioritizes, and thus kind of prioritizing value over color. And the other thing is it eliminates detail, so you don't get bogged down in the detail. Because when we start to really observe detail in our mind, it ends up taking a larger portion of our mental capacity, and we tend to distort its scale as a result of that. So by squinting, getting rid of those details, you see the major forms, and you understand the proportions more accurately. So the other thing that I have going on is I have, of course, my actual drawing in front of me, and the screen right in front of me is displaying what you're seeing, which is the overhead shot. So it's reduced the scale and it's removed any sort of perspective distortion on the paper. So that allows me to evaluate what's happening. And so I can see at this point, as I'm starting to map things out, there's a suggestion of a face there, but things appear to be a little bit out of alignment. If I look at these eyes, the way they're forming now, they don't quite have that angle to them that I see in the reference photo. So I need to adjust those. I'm going to drop this eye down a little bit, I think. And you can see by taking, just a quick stab at this, I haven't invested a whole lot of time, and it's easier for me to make adjustments. I like to suggest to beginning artists, as you're beginning to draw, try to think about the drawing process almost like you're drawing in sand, where you can make marks easily, then wipe them out and kind of move things around. The marks are meant to be moved. Is my mentality. And so by utilizing the side of the pencil, it allows the material to float on the surface a bit more. If I were to switch to this grip here, this tripod grip, and I'm pointing the tip into the paper, it tends to emboss the page, and it grinds that charcoal into the paper, and it becomes a mark that is more difficult to remove later on. So just utilizing the side of the pencil, I'm just trying to see some of these major shapes of light and shadow. And when I squint, I can see how this portion of the inner eye socket just kind of disappears altogether. I can see very little differentiation. And when I focus my eyes, I can see all the subtlety in there, but when I squint, it gets lost in this larger kind of mass of shadow. And so I want to draw that mass of shadow first, and then I'll find those subtle variations. And I want to try to evaluate how things are going to fit. It's a little bit smaller in scale, so let me see. What do I want to do here? I think I want to make things a little bit larger. Hello, more people joining. So I'm going to keep this same kind of mark established. This is that curve right inside the bridge of the nose there. And I'm going to enlarge this eye. So one of the other things, and you might all be anticipating this, all of you who have been with me for a while, we're going to enter the ugly duckling stage if we're not already there. There's a stage that we're going to go through that is going to be a little bit painful, and we have to be somewhat courageous and determined to work our way through what I refer to as the ugly duckling stage. I think, to me, there is a healthy aspect to struggling through your drawing to really discover what your subject is. And I like it when the drawing process reflects the evolution of my observations. So when I first come to this, the first thing I notice in the subject is that he's got this really kind of nice expression, but I haven't spent any time to really understand how do I know that? Like, what are the visual cues that suggest to me that he's smiling, that he has a certain kind of emotional response that he's displaying? So I'm going to hopefully be discovering that as we go, and the drawing process helps me get to that point. Sally, I think, appreciate that comment. Yeah, so we're going to be dropping down to once a week coming up soon. I need to get that kind of formalized. But I'm very excited because it means that we're going to be able to bring new artists to you as well. I want to keep doing this. This brings a lot of joy to my day. The other thing that I'm thinking about doing is I'm kind of curious to revisit some of the subjects that we addressed early on in this series. So we're at episode 55, somewhere around there. So we've been doing this for quite a while, and it all started, the first drawing was a simple cup. And then, we moved to a landscape that didn't go so well, but I think it's part of the process. We did just some fruit, and we kept it really simple to kind of ease into this, and it's gradually become a bit more complex. But I'm kind of curious to go back to some of the more simple subjects. You all have done a great job of suggesting ideas to me, so I'm always open to ideas of what we're going to cover. But I think for me, art is so much of painting and drawing is not necessarily an idea that you overcome the fundamentals, but through practice you dig into them more. You explore the fundamentals and you understand them at a deeper level. And so I think hopefully that's part of something, what we kind of express in this community is that, we embrace the fundamentals. We don't get beyond them. We just understand them more deeply. So still kind of laying out, I'm trying to work quickly, but I don't want to rush it, because the more time you spend really setting the stage, the less time is required to add those final details. It can be really seductive to go into the eyes and add all those juicy little highlights and all the good things there, but we want to try to let's save that to the end as much as possible. So one of the things too, if you haven't worked on toned paper before, the challenge that I always come to is that my eye is always calibrating to the value range in front of me, and that's something that we've talked about as well before. So just be mindful of that. What will tend to happen is that as we start to layer on lights and darks, we're going to look at these dark areas, and our brain wants to assign that as black, as the darkest part, but it can go quite a bit darker. And the same with the tone of the paper. It will start to feel like this is as light as it goes. But if we pull out this pencil here as a reminder, you can see how much brighter those highlights are going to be once we add those on there. So I want to kind of be anticipating those lighter values there. So it's difficult to do that, but I need to trust some of these early marks that I'm making. And as we get into it too, we're going to try to explore what details are really critical and what can we suggest, what needs to be really kind of made explicit, and what can we let the viewer's eye kind of chew on for a bit. There's and I talked a lot about this, I think, in the last episode, but it's been on my mind a lot lately, this idea that the brain is constantly looking for engagement, right? It wants to be excited by things. It does not like a lack of clarity. It wants to make sense of what the world is, and will often invent things in order to make sense of it. And we can use that to our advantage as artists in suggesting forms and then allowing the viewer's mind to fill in that missing information. And when it does that, when you engage the mind, all seeing happens in the mind. The brain is what puts together the visual image. The eye is just a tool for transmitting and converting photons into an electrical signal. But in terms of interpreting that electrical signal, it happens with the brain. It's the brain that ultimately sees, and it likes to make sense of things. It generally gets engaged by kind of puzzles and problem solving. And so when you suggest things and allow the brain to kind of fill in that missing information, that image that the brain creates can sometimes be more powerful than the artwork itself. So just something that I like to be thinking about when I'm working. And perhaps it's just a way for me to justify not wanting to get too much detail in the work. I just get, as you know, I get a little bit claustrophobic when I get too caught up in the detail. So maybe that's just my own justification of it. Again, you all are going to have your own association in relationship with detail. All right, so hopefully we can see now we see a portrait forming. It doesn't take much to engage the viewer's mind, and especially with a portrait, it loves to see faces. And so it'll see faces everywhere. So you don't need a whole lot. Now from this, it's just going to be a matter of bringing it all up at once and making corrections as we go. And one of the things that I really want to do is I want to be thinking about the shapes of the light and shadow first, especially in the eye sockets, and not get bogged down by really observing the eyelids, the whites of the eyes, the iris, the pupil, etc. I want to see what that overall value structure is. Jessica's asking, will you go back to figure drawing at some point? Yeah, I will actually be working on feet coming up. That's going to be tricky. I did hands earlier on. I'd love to do another drawing exploring the form of hands. I've had a hard time finding good reference photos for a larger figure, but that is something that's on my radar as well. So those are some good questions. Oh, I see some Sally here saying I teach drawing classes every week through my church. I've learned so much about both creating good drawings and teaching such a skill set to beginners. They totally believe they couldn't draw. I love that experience. So I'm glad you shared that, and it's great that you're able to work with artists and really show them that it's possible. We for some reason we identify ourselves as either able to draw or not able to draw at a very early age, and we assume that it's just for people who are gifted in some way, when in reality, it's a set of skills that we can all learn. Just some of us kind of pick it up more naturally. Let's see. I saw some questions here. So Adele, yeah, if you don't have these materials, hopefully what I discuss in terms of proportions and expressions can be applicable to any medium. So just do your best to try to convert that, translate whatever materials you have. The lessons from what I'm kind of going through will help to hopefully apply to whatever medium you've got. But I just kind of chose this medium because I really like exploring. I really like exploring the white, adding the white to bring out the highlights. Hello from Lebanon. Hello. Arlene is saying your guy looks like he wants to burst into tears. It's tricky. So one of the things, capturing expression is really tricky. And we are really good. Like every person is really kind of designed to read other people. We understand and we see kind of subtle facial expressions very easily, often in a subconscious way. And so that's quite a challenge because when we're working on a portrait, then any slight variation to the structure of the eye can be interpreted as a different expression, and that can be what's happening there. One of the things I like to do is look at the work of some great caricature artists, because what they do is they can latch on to the certain aspects of a portrait and then exaggerate it in just the right way to maintain that expression and enhance that expression. And so if you look at caricature work, some of these great caricature artists, and you see where those features are exaggerated, that can be a clue to you as to where to pay close attention in order to capture that expression. So with this subject here, he's smiling. If you see the full image that's in the description below the video, you'll see the full expression. With this, it's kind of cropped off a bit, but you can kind of sense in his eyes that he's smiling. And what I'm kind of observing is that it's in a few places. It's right in here in the inner part of the eye where there's a tightening upward. There's a squinting towards the back, and then perhaps right in here as well. There's kind of movement and tension in the muscles there. And so what I might try to do here is try to exaggerate those a little bit more to see if we really capture that expression. But I really want to get into the drawing a bit more, see how it's playing out, and then make those adjustments towards the end. But you know, I'd love to see you all share your observations, what's happening for your own drawing. So keep that up, and if there's a question that you have that I might be able to address, I will do my best. So as you can see, I'm just using the shading stump. It's kind of loading itself with charcoal by kind of smudging some of these areas, and then it becomes an effective drawing tool. As I'm going through, I'm trying to be mindful of the cross contour. So with the three-dimensional form, I'm trying to look at the direction and the kind of the flow, perhaps the texture of the skin, and how I can use these marks to reinforce that structure, if that makes sense. You're always contributing to the form. So even though this is a tool that's meant for blending and kind of smudging things out, it's an opportunity as well to contribute to the form. So I can use this to make lines to enhance the cross contour of the subject. And when I'm talking about the cross contour, one place that I can look at that is there are some creases here right on the bridge of the nose that seem to kind of wrap up and around. And if we understand the three-dimensional volume of that bridge of the nose, we can use our marks to kind of reinforce that. And imagine a line that kind of that creeps up and around over these forms, and how would that line move? How would it flow, across the page? How would it flow across the form? So at some point, your brain will switch from thinking of this as a two-dimensional object, the paper as being two-dimensional, and these marks being on that two-dimensional surface. It'll switch to then thinking of it as a three-dimensional form, and at that point, you can really start to work the direction of your marks to reinforce that three-dimensional form. Oh, is that working? I think that's working out all right. I want to double check things in terms of the proportions. I'm going to get the width of the left eye, compare that to the width of the right eye, and they should be equivalent. So if I'm roughing in there, all right, I'm in the right ballpark. And the eyes are generally one eye width apart. So if that's the start of the eyes. This may need to come in a little bit more here. I feel like this eye is getting a little bit long, and the kind of inner tear duct needs to come over a little bit more. So I want to keep an eye on this. I may end up having to move this mark over here in a little bit. This is where the kneaded eraser comes in handy, just kind of tapping that up. When I can, I'm going to try to talk about kind of the technique and how I'm holding the materials, but if I miss something that you're curious about, feel free to call that out. Or if there's something that you're doing that you think is helpful, I like to hear suggestions as well. And if you're new, I want to kind of make it clear that, you know, this is an open environment for sharing observations. So if you see something that's off, you know, I like to be called out on that, but we also like to be respectful in this group. So we haven't really talked much about kind of feedback and criticism, because I think you all are really great at sharing those observations in a constructive way. But if you have any questions or thoughts about that, let me know. Okay. Just want to check questions here. Adele is asking, can you sharpen a shading stump? I honestly don't know. That's a great question. I've never done that. I imagine you can. It is paper, so I imagine it would kind of shred to some degree. So one of the things I'm doing here is I'm just looking at the nostrils, and I'm looking at the axis that they would kind of sit on, and I just want to make sure that that it's pretty close there. All right, so I'm looking at this form here. Gets really tricky here with his beard and mustache. I'm just gonna wing it for now, see how we sneak up on it. To me, drawing gets really exciting when you try to approach each drawing as though you've never drawn before. There's a certain discovery of the materials and of the form, and so it doesn't become a kind of a system of kind of practiced movements, if that makes sense. Not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing, but for me, I get really excited, you know, with the idea that I could be really discovering something new. And so I like to have that kind of going on in the back of my mind as I'm working. Is, you know, if I try approaching something in a new way, if I start at a different place at each time I started drawing, I try holding the materials in a different way, you know, what can it do? What can it do for me? So. One of the things I'm thinking about right here is that you can see I'm building up these kind of hatch marks, and I'm placing it at the back and then kind of lifting off rather than going up and down where I can leave kind of dark marks here. I want this to be kind of soft, so it's all kind of an upward lift. All right. Joni is saying that you tried sharpening a blending stump and it didn't work. Yeah, it fell apart. I kind of imagined so. You know, I've had to take like a paper clip or something and kind of push out the tip a little bit. Aida is asking if the nose is too short. Let's check that out. So I'm going to take the measurement of the nose. So I'm going to measure, using the reference photo, I'm going to measure this point to right here in the bridge of the nose. And I'm going to compare that to the eye. And what I determined in the reference photo is that this distance here is the same as the distance from the center of the nose there right to this corner of the eye here. So I feel like I'm in the ballpark in terms of the nose. Another way you can evaluate that is angle sighting. So if I take this angle here from, say, this nostril right to the corner of this eye, there's a specific angle, and if I compare that to the reference photo, it's pretty close. I think this needs to come in a little bit more. So what you're observing is that, yeah, that relationship between this eye and the nose is off a little bit. So I'm glad you called that out. So now I'm confronted with two opportunities. I can either make the nose larger, or I could bring the eye in. And in this case, I feel like it's a little bit easier to bring the eye in because I felt like I was already kind of moving in that direction anyways. I didn't quite bring it in far enough. All right. He looks rather ghostly right now. I think I'm going to kind of just suggest something over here. I need something to anchor this down. If I come down here, I need to orient myself a little bit. One of the things that I have trouble with is really the scale relationship, as Aida was just saying, kind of between the nose and the eyes, and in particular the mouth. Because the farther you get down, the more isolated those features become. So as I'm looking at the mouth, it's harder for me to also keep aware of the scale of the eyes. You know, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth make one kind of nice, I mean, the eyes and the nose make a nice unit that I can look at. They make this nice kind of triangular formation. When I get down to the mouth, it's harder to see how that relates. So I tend to draw the mouth too large. And so I want to be kind of mindful of that and be thinking about those landmarks. And seeing how they all relate to one another. Okay, so now I think what I can do is get in and start to add some of those details. I'm gonna kind of clear my head a little bit, take a breath, working on this area that doesn't require a whole lot of thinking. And I think I want to, at this point, also kind of establish a stronger contrast between light and shadow. Even though I can bring in the light, the white chalk to bring the value up on this side, I want to try to darken this a little bit more. So hopefully we can see that, that basic structure early on. And then once I have that basic structure established, I can go in and I can start to add those details. But it's starting to appear now. So even with this gray paper, before I've added the white, I can see that contrast between light and shadow. They're saying you've firmly reached the ugly duckling stage. That's awesome. Get in there. We'll pull this drawing out. We'll get there for you. Nellie is asking about drawing somebody with glasses. That is a really good observation. I actually had really considered that for this one. It's just the reference photo that I had. The expression wasn't quite there, and so I really wanted to kind of explore expression for this one. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That's definitely something that's on my radar as well. Is how, when you have a portrait, how do you work with those glasses? Because they can be really helpful in defining the structure of somebody's head, but they can also kind of be a challenge. They can kind of make or break a drawing. So as I'm looking at the structure of the eye now, I want to try to avoid, even smooth marks. There's that symbol system we've talked about with the eye that would suggest that we draw an eye as two kind of curves with a circle in the middle. And that can be really challenging to overcome. And one of the ways to help do that is to try to visualize a curve as a sequence of short, straight marks. So as I follow along the upper eyelid, I can see as a distinct angle on this back end. It kind of turns a little bit, and then it turns a little bit more. And then as I look at the structure of the eye, you can see this skin on the kind of in the eye socket on the upper eyelid kind of folds in on top, and then over here the kind of the inner part of that eyelid, upper eyelid, kind of falls out underneath, and so it's not a smooth line. It's kind of two overlapping kind of curves there. And I know that those are, I think, going to be really important in helping to capture that expression, really observing the way those curves interact with one another. So at this point, I'm still using the HB pencil, which is a bit harder of a charcoal. It doesn't get quite as dark as the 6B. I'm going to come back in with the 6B to really hit those darker areas. As I move across here, I want to be thinking about the basic structure. I want to be careful not to draw lines that are too strong. So I'm going to kind of do these short circular marks that the eye will interpret more as thin areas of shadow rather than a contour line at the edge of an object. And so I'm just kind of working my way around the eye. This bottom eyelid is really kind of tricky, and I think to enhance that, I want to, if anything, I want to make the eye squint a little bit more. I haven't really defined that bottom eyelid at this point, so I want to be, this is where I can really kind of observe that, and really observe the overlap of that upper eyelid to that lower eyelid. Where is that intersection of that lower eyelid underneath the upper one? Because they don't come together at a perfect point. And you can see how there's really a solid shadow being cast by that upper eyelid onto the lower one back in here. You get this little zigzag as you fall into these creases. That'll help to capture that expression. And then this lower eyelid is really important. So what I want to try to observe is anything in the structure of the muscles and the anatomy that could be helpful. And so what we can see again is a sequence of compound curves. There's this kind of sharper point right in here where this muscle comes in on top of this inner muscle here in the eyelid. So then we have this kind of intersection right here. And if I try to pull that in a little bit more, enhance this a little bit more, hopefully it'll kind of feel like there's a bit more tension pulling into the inner part of the eye socket there. This is where I'm going to pull this out, the shading stump. Because I want to make sure each of these folds feels like a three-dimensional form. So there's a kind of an outer surface that's reflecting the light. There's kind of a bounce light section as you make that turn, and then there's a darker line at in the inner crease of that eye, of the kind of fold under the eye. And so I want to observe that in each of these folds because that will help to really enhance the three-dimensional quality of that eye. Utilizing the side of the pencil, I think, is really a key for me too as I draw each of these little creases, because it tends to create a mark that is more easily interpreted as a crease and not as a line. And so for those of you who have been with this for a while, I've said that quite a bit in this series, is to be mindful of your line work, because if the viewer interprets a line as a contour, then it suggests that's the outer edge of an object, a distinct object that has an outer edge. In this case, these creases are not edges of objects. They're parts of a larger form. And so we want the viewer's mind to interpret this as a thin shadow, not a contour line. It's really difficult to see the edge of the iris on the left here. It all kind of falls into that shadow, but you can see this distinctly, and look for that negative space in the white of the eye. Now, and one of the reasons I wanted to start with this toned paper is one of the challenges I see with a lot of beginning students. So if you're just getting started, you really want to observe the value of the whites of the eyes. The eyes are generally in a socket, which means they're in shadow. And even though our brain tells us, oh, that's the white of an eye, it's actually not white. It's a gray. It's that white that's cast into that shadow. And so we'll explore that a little bit more as we get into this. But again, I'm going to really want to enhance this a little bit here. Okay, I'm losing some of the chat here, so I do want to check in. Let's see. Looks like we're good here. So no questions coming through. Hatching shading technique seems recognizable. Good. Yeah, I don't necessarily have a distinct hatching pattern the way some artists do. I see some really great artists out there who, you know, they'll pick a lane in terms of the hatching. They'll do cross hatching, or they'll do a kind of a single direction hatching. I don't necessarily do that. For me, what's most important is really the kind of understanding the structure, make sure that the marks that I have aren't impeding the structure, that they're working with the structure, if that makes sense. And when in doubt, move to a circular mark. So, Dallas is saying, I have a hard time drawing deeper eye sockets with pencils and color pencils. So yeah, it's really tricky. And I think for me, what has helped, or I generally do better when I let my eyes stay out of focus longer than is comfortable. Because as I really focus on any particular aspect of the eyeball, it gets really distorted. I start to draw things that are sharper and clearer than they actually are. So when I squint my eyes and it eliminates the detail for me, then it helps me to identify what I need to spend most of my time with. What do I really need to define? And as I'm making my marks, I'm also trying to be aware. I do these quick check-ins with the area around it. So as I'm working in this inner tear duct, I'm also checking in with some of these other marks, comparing that to the reference photo, just to see if anything kind of stands out as being off. It's one of the other things that we talk a lot about in this series, is developing the ability to split your attention. And so you may be making marks in one area, but actually thinking about another area. I want to get this eyeball here. One of the things that also kind of occurred to me as I was doing my preparatory sketches, we've talked about the structure of the eye before, and how generally the upper eyelid, it sits down a little bit lower on the eyeball, the lower eyelid kind of comes in underneath it, so it places the iris a little bit higher relative to the upper and lower eyelids. In this case, he's not really doing that. I think because he's squinting and bringing his lower eyelid up, it's kind of equalizing that. If he was more relaxed, letting his eyes open wide, then what would happen is this lower eyelid would drop down, but the upper eyelid would generally stay the same or very similar, and then that would make it feel like the iris is higher in that eyeball. So that's just an observation that I made, and I think it can be critical. It's one of those little things that can sometimes make a big difference in the drawing in terms of capturing that expression. It's just like if I don't place that correctly, if I don't look at the negative space over here, it may seem like he's looking in one direction or the other. So the placement and the quality of these curves, the placement of the iris between the upper and lower eyelids becomes an important part of capturing expression. So just something to be thinking about. All right, let's see. As I'm kind of blending with the shading stuff, I'm not being too worried about kind of smudges. They just they just add to the character of the drawing. But if any of these marks seem to be conflicting with the structure, if it's making it harder to really see the structure, then I might need to adjust them. There's a question, Reyes is asking what pencil. So I have a list of the materials in the description below the video. That's going to list out what I'm using. Basically just using charcoal pencils and erasers, and then the shading stump. But if you're new to drawing, I think it's important and helpful to experiment with different materials. But also know that so much can be done with just a yellow number 2 pencil, just a standard pencil. You don't have to have the right materials in order to make a good drawing. There's some amazing work done. See a lot of artists working in ballpoint pen. A lot of just a regular number 2 pencil. It can get you so much of the way. And what I'd hate to have happen is anybody feel like they want to draw, but they're inhibited because they don't have the right materials. Just pick up something and explore it. Play around with papers as well. That's one of the aspects that is often overlooked, is the importance of paper, because sometimes you can do everything right in a drawing, but it's not coming out just because the material is just not working with the paper. It's kind of sticking to it, or maybe it's just falling off of it. So if you're using charcoal, try to find a good charcoal paper. So as I'm down here, I'm really looking at clues about the structure here. So we see this part here, the side of the nose, is a little bit more hard, and it makes it kind of more of a solid line. The softer part of that lower eyelid, and I don't know the specific anatomical terms, but kind of cuts in behind that. So there's kind of a sharp intersection between those two elements that I think is really helpful in terms of creating that structure. So I'm gonna need to observe that. Then we fall down here. Again, the soft part of that lower eyelid, remember the eyeball is a sphere in there that's falling away into the eye socket. And so this skin here just becomes softer. There's less support underneath it. But then we hit the harder bone of that lower eye socket in the cheekbone here. And so that's what we see at this point, is we see a harder line at that intersection between those two. And so paying attention to the quality of the edges and how those lines change as they relate to the structure can be important. Now, you don't necessarily have to know anatomy in order to do that, but if you take just a few seconds to really kind of question what's in front of you there, that can sometimes reveal some healthy information. Just using the kneaded eraser to pull out some of the lighter spots in the eye socket where there's some reflected light bouncing off of there. There's light striking along here in the upper part of that lower eyelid. We fall down here where it's light on this side falling into shadow. And then we can see down here where we see that cheek, there's a bit of that cheekbone becomes visible here, and then the soft, kind of the muscles of the cheek become more visible as they wrap kind of around. And then there's this interesting shadow right here that falls across the nose that I want to get. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good about the overall proportions. If anybody's seeing anything that needs to be addressed, I always welcome those suggestions. Artist Flame asking, when am I starting the once a week? It may be next week that we're going to do that. I believe it's next week. We're actually just going to be doing a Monday session. I'll be updating the Drawing Together page with that soon. The other thing you're going to notice in the description is a link to the Drawing Together landing page for this episode where you can share your work. So as soon as we're done here, as soon as you're done with your drawing, you can log in there, copy and paste that URL, and you can share your work with the community there. Mary's asking about the photo reference. So this is one that I grabbed from Pixabay. I did not take this one myself. I do typically prefer to take my own reference photos, but in the interest of time, and I found this great photo, I'm like, oh, I gotta do this one. So I'm just pulling out some of the reflected light in here using the kneaded eraser, so kind of pinching it to create a kind of a sharper edge. And so as we look at this structure here, there's light catching here a little bit more, and as we come down into here, into the cheekbone, it's a little bit more into shadow. And so I think that's important to help kind of convey that structure. And it's hard to see if you're really focusing on this area. I observed that subtle shift in value by looking at it indirectly. So as I look here on the reference photo, I'm putting my awareness on this. And when I do that, I recognize that that's a little bit darker than this. When I'm staring at the drawing as a whole, I don't necessarily observe that. So it might be something that you do as well as you're doing a check-in to evaluate your proportions and your values as you're starting to refine them. Practice some of those indirect observations, because it can really help to identify some areas that could be adjusted. All right. And then there's a little bit of light kind of catching on here. So as I observe these folds, you see these darker creases, and then it gets a little bit lighter on the top surface. Not right up against that dark edge, though. Okay. So we're starting to now refine the drawing. I'm kind of doing a double check because I want to make sure the overall proportions are good. If something feels off here, I feel like I do need to bring this down. There's just that I was a bit too open, I think. So just using that kneaded eraser, it's very light. It's a very light touch. I'm just kind of swiping across. It's actually blending more than anything. Yeah, and then I'm looking at some of the structure. That feels a little bit better there. Kind of like that, the quality of the marks a bit more. Although I do feel like this is a bit too rounded here, so I'm going to kind of cut that down a little bit more. There we go. That's one of the, this approach works for me in terms of building up these larger shapes. And one of the reasons why is situations like that where I can kind of carve away at the drawing a bit more. I find that when I start thinking about the drawing linearly, when I start drawing kind of outer edges of the forms in line and then shade it in, I'm less willing to adjust and adapt as I go. So it's really kind of part of a mental strategy for me because I know what works and what doesn't. But again, it might be something that works for you, and it's just something that I need to be kind of aware of. But just kind of want to share kind of my thinking around that so that you can see how it might apply to your work. So I'm just kind of working on some of those hairs as I'm working on the eyebrows. I'm using the side of the pencil. This is still the HB pencil. And I'm thinking more about the flow of the hair rather than any individual hair. Rolling the pencil in my fingers. But I find that mark tends to create a more realistic looking kind of hair than switching to the tripod grip and really trying to draw each line. Donna is asking, how do you decide which highlight is paper color and which is reserved for the white pencil? That's a good question. You know, I know, like, if I look at this part on the reference photo, there's a brighter highlight, so I know that's going to be in light. As I build up the other shadows, what I want to do is, in this section here, I don't want to get any brighter than the white of the paper. And then that's going to help to establish a value hierarchy. where I know that the highest I go is just the tone of the paper. Over here, I can bring up those lighter values higher. And I think that is hopefully going to help to create that differentiation between light and shadow, those big kind of decisions. And as such, I may end up having to go a little bit darker on this side. So I'm reserving my 6B pencil for that as well. So I haven't brought in that really dark yet. One of the things I felt like I did in my preparatory sketch is I overused that 6B, and I didn't have quite enough variety in that, in kind of the darks there. It felt like it was middle gray and then black, and then bring out the highlights. So I'm hoping that if I stick with the HB a little bit longer, that it will help me to establish more variety in the end. So that's a really good question. Thank you for that. Will we get another full beard photo? Oh, ingratiate. So you also asked how to draw the eyebrow. So hopefully it looks like that you came in right as I started to draw the eyebrow. So hopefully that's answering your question as you're seeing this. And then another full beard photo. So the reference photo does have the full beard. I don't know if I have any plans in the works to do another one anytime soon, but I can definitely put that on the list. So. And when I'm working with the eyebrow, it's really just utilizing the weight of the pencil to kind of sneak up on it. It makes these thin lines, and if I roll the pencil in my fingers, it helps to create those really nice, sharp, fine lines. But if I need it darker, then I can build up a bit more and then start to apply a little bit more pressure. So like right in here, for example, there's a bit more shadow there. The same with over here. It's a little bit more shaded underneath the eyebrow. And it's a back and forth. There's a push and a pull to get those fine marks. But I don't need a sharp. I mean, you look at this, and that's not very sharp at all. It's a very kind of dull point at this point, and I'm not utilizing that point to create those fine marks. And part of that, part of the reason I draw this way is I just don't have the patience to stop and sharpen my pencil. I like to get into it. I just feel like it takes me out of the whole moment when I have to do that. And so it's perhaps that's laziness on my part. But I really don't. It's very rare that I sharpen a pencil during a drawing. So. All right, so I'm kind of working on this area. It's a little bit easier before I move over to this eye, so I'm just kind of decompressing a little bit. Thinking about this structure here, and as I look at this curve, again, I want to break it down into sections, short, straight sections here. And then as I look at the nostril, I want to be careful about this. So it's not one continual mark. There's this curve in here, kind of like a parenthesis mark, and it comes underneath, and then the nostril here kind of floats in above it, and is generally a straighter mark, and curves down a little bit to here. And I want to try to get rid of that line as much as possible, do some negative drawings, darkening that background to hopefully bring that nose forward. And I can start to suggest the beard as well, so I can start to see some of that texture there. As we come up here, I just want to observe this. This is really kind of a tricky, but you can kind of break this down into two angles. They're very subtle. It's almost a straight line, but it makes a bit of a curve there. And then we have this curve in along here, and that's a little bit sharper. And then we see this kind of flat section in here between the nostril and then the cheek. And then we get a darker marking along here where that cheek kind of wraps around and folds in. And so what I'm trying to do to kind of get back to that question, how do you know what to leave the gray of the paper, is I'm trying to basically get as far as I can with the gray of the paper and then use the white more sparingly. I felt like in my preparatory one, I relied on the white too much to kind of bring out those highlights and expand that value range. So in this one, I'm going to try to stick with it a little bit longer. Kind of hold off on using the white until I really need it and see how much I can convey without that. Dallas is asking, how do you draw with a ballpoint pen? That's tricky. It's been a long time since I've done that, so perhaps that's another episode I could be doing, is to try to draw with a ballpoint pen. Heather is saying, yeah, why is it going down to once a week? Eventually we're going to get there. It's something that we're considering. It's mostly kind of a time issue. Like I said, we're also trying to get new series developed for you. So I've got some new live streams in the works with other artists that we really want to kind of expand on this. And so I'll be, I generally, with Artist Network, I'm kind of behind the scenes in a lot of these video projects. And I want to get some more projects going, bring more artists in, build the community more. Because there are some great artists out there that I want you all to hear from. Okay, trying to think through the structure here, looking at some of the you can start to see the flow of the flesh in some of these areas. So I'm trying to, I'm not getting bogged down in very specific detail, but generally getting a flow, an understanding of the flow of that skin, and trying to allow these, allowing my shading stump to kind of follow with that a little bit. So, all right, I feel like that's working out okay. Evaluating, what I'm doing is, instead of, I'm not staring at you, I'm staring at the drawing on the screen. It helps me to kind of evaluate. It's equivalent to you setting up your drawing and stepping back at a distance to see how it's holding up. And if you haven't done that, if you're following along and you haven't done that, I encourage you to do so. Step back from your work. Okay, here's what I think I need to do. I think I need to come in now with my darkest dark, and then I'm going to come in with my lightest light. Erase out some of that light here in that upper eyelid. I've got my 6B. I'm going to darken that. I can't really see a whole lot in his eyeball there. That it's amazing. Like it always blows my mind. So my eye had just kind of calibrated to those darks there. I'm looking at that. I'm like, that looks like black. I come in on top with this, and it's even darker. I love that. I kind of getting back to that thought. I can't really see the pupil and the differentiation between the pupil and the iris very easily. So I'm trying to see if there's any sort of indicator. In general, though, I think what I need to do is darken up here at the top and be a little bit softer towards the bottom. This is a pretty sharp line here. So utilizing the side of the pencil, just these kind of small circular marks there. And as I come in through here, I want to just be careful not to overdo these darks. So I want to find areas in the reference photo where it might be the darkest dark. This upper edge here is a little bit soft because of the eyelashes, so I'm going to let those marks be a little bit soft. So what I did in my preparatory one is I overstated. I used the 6B too much, and so again I want to be more sparing in this go around. So I think I'm just going to use it on that upper eyelid. Maybe just a touch right in here. Okay, and then I'm going to come over to this one. And then this side of the head is in shadow, so I feel like I can be a little bit heavier with the 6B on this side of the head. All right, this is requiring just a little bit more focus, so trying to think if there's anything to pay attention to. So one of the things that I'm observing is that you have this kind of inner portion of the eyelid and then this outer portion that's kind of folding in on top. The eyelash is really on the inner portion, and so in this case they're kind of being consumed by the skin on the upper eyelid that's folding in on top of it. So you can't really see these eyelashes. They're kind of sticking out underneath that. And as in this dark area, as I add that dark value, I'm just kind of doing it in the center of the larger dark mark that I had made. And that adds a little bit more dimensionality to those dark marks that were there. So if you're kind of worried about it, if you feel like you're overstating these darks, kind of try to think of them more as like connect the dots. Really, just add a kind of little dits and dashes there, here and there, rather than making a hard kind of consistent mark. And that will read more naturalistically. How's that working? I think that's working okay. Coming under here, see where the darkest parts are, so I don't want to overdo it. Right in under here, under this fold. And I'm already feeling a bit better about this than the preparatory one. So that's, again, it's one of the things to remind yourselves if you're getting frustrated. I've done this now, this is my second time, so I have a bit more familiarity. I can, this is going to be a bit more accurate. Your drawing will be better the second time around as well. So if you are struggling and you find yourself being self-critical, hopefully you're being kind to yourselves and not being too harsh with that. So okay. But I am feeling, I have noticed that I feel more confident in general with portraiture. If you've been with the series for a while, you know that this has been more of a challenge for me. Especially some of the earlier ones were really a bit of a struggle, but I'm starting to feel more confident, and that's kind of what I was going for in this whole series. And so one of the reasons I want to start to revisit some of the earlier subjects, just to see if there's any sort of observable improvement. And maybe not exactly the same reference image, but something similar. So it may do something like a simple cup. And sometimes it's, it's nice to be able to step back into something that's a little bit more simple, not always feel like you're kind of having to push each one to become more challenging than the one before. Okay. What am I thinking? Just trying to suggest the beard, but I don't want to overdo it. Actually, I'm going to switch back to the HB. Over on this side where it's in light, I don't need it to be quite as dark. Let's try to suggest some of that side of the head. All right, I think we are at the point now where we can bring in that white chalk and really start to pull out those highlights. Let's make this thing sing. All right. Model has a lot of freckles. How do you deal with that? That's a good observation. I generally don't get bogged down in freckles. You know, there's, you know, it's one of the reasons I'm not kind of being too precise as I kind of smudge like this and blend. You can, nobody's face is super smooth, you know, perfectly smooth, and so it kind of lends itself to suggesting some of those variations. Actually, I do want to. Bring that in there. Okay. I can't pronounce it. Cassiana. There's an amazing picture of Robin Williams. You want to draw? Go for it. Liz Millers, how do I get the right cheek puffy? Now, this may help. If you do have the white chalk, this may help you to do that. So let's actually start over on that area. I'm going to start on this side. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for the brightest bright. So I can see in general there's an overall kind of light side to this. So as I start to kind of lay that in, I'm just using the side of the white charcoal, kind of scraping it across the side, and I'm thinking about the overall form of light. And while I'm doing that, I'm making mental notes of where do I feel like the hot spots are. Because it can be actually kind of tricky to identify them. Because there's no real kind of sharp edge here. So I just want to observe that. But going back to the question about how do you make the cheeks puffy, I think getting the right value contrast is going to be great. So the stronger the contrast between the highlights and the shadows, I think the more you're going to be able to convey that form. And so one of the things that I like to do here as well is just by scraping the material across the surface, this is really just the weight of the pencil on the surface. By allowing it to kind of scrape across the surface, I'm utilizing the texture of the paper that simulates the texture of the subject here. So using the tooth of the paper to simulate the texture of the skin. So I don't want to kind of flatten out the paper. So I'm looking kind of for the larger areas of light, and then I'm going to come back in and drop in some of those highlights. I wanted to get back up here before I forget it. There's a little light hitting that upper part of the brow. So I'm trying to be mindful of the pressure control as well. So again, mostly utilizing the weight of the pencil. And then by utilizing the side of the pencil, I'm always keeping that point sharp when I need it. I'm going to need that when I get into that eyeball and add those little points of light there. So I'm just kind of bringing up this whole section here. And then I'm kind of jumping all over the place. My mind is a little scattered, so my drawing is becoming a little scattered. So I'm just trying to call that observation now. You're probably, if you're trying to follow along, you may realize that I'm just jumping all over the place. And if you're questioning that, you're right, I am. So again, as I'm making these marks here, I'm rolling the pencil in my fingers. It makes kind of for a more naturalistic mark overall. And then when I get over here, so you can see in the mustache, there's light and then shadow. I don't want to overstate this. So what I might actually do is, rather than apply white to signify the white whiskers, I think I'm going to use my eraser to kind of pull some of that out, and hopefully it'll be read as kind of white that's in that shadow. And then using the eraser, there's a certain element where the eraser is just kind of blending. But as you push down harder, it will it'll lift off more of the material. So I'm going to see how that reads. I feel like that reads all right. So yeah, again, we understand that these are white whiskers, but in my attempt to keep that in shadow, I'm not going any lighter than the gray tone there. So if you are working on white paper, it might just be something to observe is do you see a distinction between the light over here and the shadow over here? Got to take a breath. I think I want to add a little bit more structure in here. Really try to find the volume of that nostril. All right, here in the front of the nose, it gets a little bit darker right here. Okay. Rock Art 54, I appreciate those comments. A lot of good comments here. Liz saying it's working, excellent. I'm glad to hear that it's making that right cheek puffy for you. All right, so as I go down the nose here, I'm just going to try to observe the way the light's falling on there. Trying to keep in mind the structure of the nose, and so I'm trying to follow along the cross contour. Again, just utilizing the side of the pencil, just using the weight of the pencil at first, and I can bear down a little bit more to create the hot spots where the light's stronger. So what I'm trying to observe is also kind of where the edges are a bit harder and where they're softer. So for example, on the light on the nose, it's a little bit sharper of an edge along this side. It's not a hard edge, but sharper than this, and that helps to create that rounded quality. So that's something that I want to try to capture as well. And then there's light catching. So generally the light catches at the turn, like the apex of the turns. So here on the nostril, for example, is catching the light there. Right here along the bridge of the nose is catching that there. And so it's often brightest near the tip, and then right here at the turn in the brow. I just want to kind of soften that edge, really create that fall off. There's a little bit of bounce light striking in here that I want to capture. Let's see how that's reading. And right in here as well. So that variation as we follow along this path is going to be really helpful in terms of creating that volume of the nose. So that's what I'm looking at there. You can start to see there's an external light source coming in from this direction, bouncing off this side of the nose that I'm trying to capture. And then right here, even though we're in shadow, there's a little bit of a light there, but maybe I want to lift that off rather than use the white. So I don't want to overstate it. Yeah, I think that's too much. One of those things that I see often happening is overstating the bounce light, and I think I had done that. So let me evaluate there. That's a bit better. I want that to be subtle. Just going to pick up a little bit more charcoal here so I can deposit it here. All right, now I'm going to get back to the nose here because I want to get those hot spots on there. Oh, I'm glad that Gracia is saying that the eraser technique is better. Excellent. Street of Smiley, you're going to start. Excellent. Welcome to the group. Krisha is saying, why is that create a color white chalk never worked for me on white paper? I guess more black. Is there any reason? So yeah, white on the white paper is often really a challenge to make work. It typically it gets muddy by the whatever charcoal is on the page, and so just want to be careful with that. I find that it really works best on a toned paper. Let's see, I just broke the fine tip off of there. What I'm doing now is I'm looking for those kind of the hot spots. Where are the brightest spots? And I'm coming back in with another pass. I'm applying a little bit more pressure, but I want to also observe how, what's the quality of the edge here. It's really hard to define where that hot spot kind of ends. And so I'm trying to be mindful of that. And then I'm also looking at some of these creases here. How can we kind of reinforce the structure of some of these creases? Like right in here, these folds, there's little highlights in there that have distinct shapes. So if you can see those shapes, so you see there's a shadow side, there's kind of a mid-tone side, and then the highlight. If you can get those three, that helps to create a sense of volume. So a highlight, a middle tone, and a shadow. There's highlights here. The light is catching on the turn of that lower eyelid. And as we come up here again, each of these folds has 3 dimensions to it. So try to find where is the highlight, where is that middle tone, where is that shadow. Light's catching a little bit more strongly in here. Get some of these white hairs while I'm at it. And then right in here, I feel like there's a stronger highlight catching on each of these little folds there. So again, utilizing the tooth of the paper to help with some of that texture. I'm still using the side of the pencil to help with that. As we come up here, it's funny, there's little bits of light catching on some of the texture of his skin here. And then there's a hot spot right in here. Feather that out. Now this gets, I want to take a little bit more time in here because there's a lot of light hitting there. And if you look at this stretch here, from this part to this part, right between, there's a plane that angles inward. And that's what I want to try to capture, to try to create that sense of depth. So I'm using the shading stump to kind of reinforce some of that. So I'm overstating some of those marks. And then what I'll do is I'll come back in and with the white chalk on top of that to knock that back down. But I'm trying to observe that plane. So I'm changing the direction of my marks here to create that vertical plane. I got to just kind of work that area a little bit more. And then pull out the highlight right on top. This is where I can really bear down a little bit because there's that hot spot right on the ridge of the nose. And it kind of trails off down in here. A little bit of a highlight right in here. How does that read? All right, yeah, I like that dimensionality of the nose there. So I want to evaluate this light here, make sure that that sticks in the shadow. I feel like it does. Yeah, all right, that works. Now we get into the eye. Now we should be almost done. But you can see these little specks of light. It suggests that he's outdoors. You can kind of get a sense of the trees back in there. So I'm going to try to drop these in. This is where I'm switching my grip. I think this is the only time in the drawing where I'm actually switching to this tripod grip. And what I want to do, what I like to do is actually with the whites of the eyes, even though they're very gray, I'm gonna do a little mixing of them to try to distinguish the quality of the gray of the paper a bit. So what I'm going to do is just kind of do a soft circular technique around in here, and I'm going to lay in some of that white charcoal, and then I can smooth that out with a shading stump, and then it helps to create a sense of the softness of the white of the eyes and distinguish it from the texture of the skin there. But I think we're just about done for today. I can't remember what we're doing on Monday, but I think it's the feet on Monday that we're going to be doing, 3 p.m. Eastern. And we're going to have more information on the Drawing Together page about the upcoming schedule, so come check that out. You can share your work at Artist Network, so you'll find the link in the description below where you can copy and paste that link and go to Artist Network to the show page where you can share your work. Love to see what you're all working on. I just have to say how impressed I am by the quality of work that's being shared there. It's amazing. I mean, there's some really nice work, and one of the things that I really like is when you all share your kind of overall experiences. You know, sometimes it just doesn't come together, and you all are very brave in sharing that and say, hey, this just didn't work. You know, but it was a good attempt. So I'm glad to see that, and that's the type of environment we like to create here. Is one where you're you feel comfortable kind of in being vulnerable, sharing what's working and what's not. All right, what do we think? How do we feel about that? But you can see by adding that white chalk there, it just changes that texture just slightly, so it feels more like the white of an eye. And if because we have the tooth of the paper showing through here, it creates a nice contrast. All right. Aida, I'm glad to hear these comments. Let's see, Scott, will you work on the highlight of the iris? Yes, so we got that in there, so hopefully that works. Hopefully that reads properly for you all. I just want to do a kind of quick check-in to see if there's any areas that I missed. And what I might actually do is I kind of like there's some little highlights on the left here. I want to see what happens if I accentuate them just a bit more. See if that adds a little bit more dimensionality here. But I'll hang on. I don't think I'm adding a whole lot more to this, but I'll hang on for a few more minutes if anybody has any additional questions. There is a bit of a lag, so I try to catch everybody, but I always miss a good question that comes in right at the end after I've signed off. So I'm trying. One day I'll get this figured out. Let's see. For some reason, my white won't take over the gray. Interesting, Joy. So it's not sticking. I'd be curious what white you are using, because I have noticed a difference. This is a charcoal white by Generals, and I've noticed a difference between that and this pastel chalk, also made by Generals. I feel like the charcoal white works a little bit better for me, but it could just be the way I'm using it. So I'd be curious what that is. Sally is asking, where do we share? So if you, let's see, if you go to artistnetwork.com, on the home page, you'll see Drawing Together at the top of the menu there. You can click on that page, and that takes you to the Drawing Together landing page, the home page for Drawing Together. And you'll see all the subjects listed out. And if you click on the subject, you'll be brought to the show page for that, where you'll see a link to the video as well as the discussions underneath. And then for this specifically, you'll find it in the description below. You'll find the full URL that you need to copy and paste into your browser, and that will take you directly to the landing page for the show where you can share your work. So hopefully that makes sense. Ingratius, is it better to try with the lines? Oh yeah, Ingratius, I'm glad to hear that you're trying something new. Again, you want to try to find what works for you. I like to come in with lines towards the end. to help kind of add accents or movement or kind of expression. I always get tripped up when I try to start a drawing using line. But I think that's really kind of coming out of my practice as an oil painter more than anything. Oh, Joy's saying you're working with graphite pencils. Yeah, so what can happen if you are working with graphite, you'll need to clear the page first. That graphite can be really slick, and so it's really difficult for anything to sit on top of it. So use your eraser to erase off back down to the paper, and then you can put your white in that area, if that makes sense. Oh, Mary D. Lake is asking about sharpening a pencil. Why don't I do that right now? I can do that here quickly. So here's my pencil, my razor blade, and it's really just a matter of this. You got to make sure you have a clean, kind of sharp razor, but I'm just using my razor blade, taking my thumb and kind of pushing it up to the edge and sharpening it that way. That's really all that is to it. And then if I need a sharper point, then what I'll do is I'll just sand this on some sandpaper, but I generally don't even need to do that. I just kind of carve away the wood. So there you have that. Did that illustrate it? Did we catch that? I wasn't even looking at the screen, so hopefully you saw that. And then Irene is asking, when did I start drawing? Are you talking about this drawing itself? This one's about an hour and a half, but in general in my career, I didn't start drawing seriously until high school, and then I went to art school where we did a lot of drawing. So it's been a good solid 25 years or so that I've been drawing. I've kind of committed to improving my drawing. And one of the reasons I started this series is because it's a practice that I had neglected myself, and I've been finding it really helpful. I have found that it's improved my painting. I wanted to start this as a way to continue developing my skills when I'm inside more, and it's kind of worked out that way, so I'm very happy with that, and hopefully it's been the same for you. Jessica's, can you add the one crease in between closer to the right eye? This one? Yes. It's funny, I think I had placed that in earlier. I think it somehow kind of faded away as it happens sometimes. Is that the one? Anything else I'm missing? I'm just kind of going through. That was a very good observation, if that's the right one, Jessica. All right, I'm glad to hear that, Joan. Thanks for confirming that drawing is improving. I feel like I'm getting better. Some of the earlier ones I look back on and I say, yeah, that's why we're here. We're practicing, trying to get better. And in general, what that means in terms of getting better is just kind of getting at more accurate proportions more quickly and with more confidence. That's generally how things kind of improve. Is just kind of gaining more confidence in the material and kind of getting at something that's correct more quickly. But it may be different for you all. What improvement looks like to each of you. All right, I think that works better. I really like this lower eyelid here. I think I need to add a little bit more kind of structure there. All right, but I think I'm going to sign off. Jessica, I'm glad that's the right one. Thank you all. I will see you all on Monday. Have a fantastic weekend. Everybody stay safe. Keep practicing. I can't wait to see your work. And thank you all. This is awesome.